We are journeying with humans. When we talk about the transformation of our thinking, of our minds, we need to constantly be reminded that this happens because we are journeying with other humans. Other humans make this possible. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a protege of Carl Sagan and considered one of the more brilliant people on our planet. And he was on a plane flying somewhere, and he was sitting next to a potato farmer from eastern Washington. And it was a long flight, and Neil suggested to the farmer that they might pass the time by playing a game. And the farmer said, okay. And he said, I'll ask you a question, and if you can't answer it, you pay me $5. And then you can ask me a question, and if I can't answer it, I'll pay you $500. The farmer thought, well, that sounds like a pretty fair risk. So Neil said, well, I'll go first. He says, okay. He said, how far is it from the earth to the moon? Farmer thought for a moment, reached in his pocket and pulled out a $5 bill and handed it to Neil. And Neil said, okay, it's your turn. The farmer said, what goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 4? And Neil thought, and he sat there for 20 minutes, scratching his mind and trying to think of the answer to this. And finally he said, I have no idea. And he handed the guy $500. He goes, thank you. And so then Neil was turned. He says, all right, what goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 4? And the man pulled out $5 and handed it to him. I recently watched a video of a lady who is studying trees. And I think this was in British Columbia. And there were a grove of trees, and she discovered that in this grove of trees, the trees actually communicate with each other. That they send through their roots and through the ground different messages or whatever, very crude and primitive, of course. But information was being passed from tree to tree. And in this grove, there was one large tree who was the matriarch. And all the information passed back and forth through this one tree. And curiously, there was one tree in the grove that didn't participate. And had no connection to anyone else. I think it was a cedar tree, oddly enough. But she was marveling about this fact of nature that we had no clue about, that nature is so connected. And it made me once again realize how connected we are to each other and don't think that we are. We sort of imagine ourselves as an isolated person that's moving through life, but the truth is that we're very, very connected, and much of our spiritual growth has to do with how we connect to other people. And people that try to live in isolation do not turn out well. We need each other. We need that connection. And I want you to turn your Bibles to 16th chapter of Acts, and there's several connections that happen there that I want to talk to you about this morning because I think they shed light on how we need to proceed in our own connections to other people. Now, this is another pretty long chapter, and let me just sort of breeze through here and tell you what happens, and then I want to go back and focus on a few things. It starts out in the beginning of the chapter with Paul and Silas coming to a area called Lystra, which is sort of central Turkey, and they run into a young man whose name is Timothy, and Timothy, of course, is going to be part of Paul's life from here on in. In fact, later on there will even be a couple of letters that Paul writes to him. That are included in the New Testament. So Timothy is a significant person, and so from this point on in this journey, there are the 3 gospelteers, and the 3 guys together, and they're working through there, and so they're moving to the west, toward central and kind of the eastern part of Turkey, and their intention is to head to the south. And it says that somehow they were stopped. They were prevented from going that way. We don't know how they were prevented. Maybe they heard reports of trouble down that area. Maybe there were bandits on the road. Maybe God just simply put a sense in their hearts that this is not a good thing. Sometimes God's directions to me just come from a sensation. I just think, there's just something's amiss. Something's wrong. I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't preach that. I've said things in sermons that God said, don't say that, and I said them anyway, and later I regretted it. But sometimes that's how God directs us. It's just sort of this uneasiness. It may have been something as simple as that. But nevertheless, they continue a little bit further west, and then Paul has a vision of a person across the water in Macedonia, and encouraging them to come over. So he takes that as a sign from God. And so they travel across this small body of water over to Macedonia, and they begin working their way south. And they end up in Philippi, and there they met Lydia, who's a very significant person. And as they're working there in that place, they encounter a young lady who's demon-possessed. And her demon possession is very similar to other demon possessions we've read about throughout the New Testament. And she somehow has the ability to help people understand their future. And I'm not exactly sure what this means, because obviously the evil powers they're not omnipresent, they don't have access to the future, they don't really know what's going to happen, but somehow they're able to interpret events and give people some sense that they know what's going to happen in their future. So I don't know how that's working, but she was making money at it, and she's following them around, and she's actually saying truth. She said, these people are servants of the Most High God. You'd think that'd be a great thing. But it becomes irritating to Paul because it's not God that's speaking, it's a demonic presence that's speaking. So finally he just turns and rebukes it, and it leaves the lady, which causes a turmoil, and the owners are upset because they've lost their income, and they end up beating Paul and Silas and throwing them into jail. Middle of the night, there's an earthquake, similar to what happened to Peter. Their chains fall off, the doors are open. The jailer assumes they've all escaped and he's about to commit suicide. And Paul says, don't do it, we're still here. Then there was an encounter with the jailer. And so then at the end of the account, the next day, the magistrates send and tell him to release Paul. And Paul said, we're not going because you had no right to beat us. And so there's some turmoil there. So I want to go back and I want to talk about three instances in this chapter and Paul's connection to them. And the first thing that happens is his encounter with Timothy. And Timothy's mother was Jewish and his father was Greek. And his mother was a believer. We presume his father was not. And so there's tension there. And Paul decides that in order to proceed in his ministry, which is largely based in the Jewish community, starts in the Jewish community, at least at this point, he decides that he needs to have Timothy circumcised because obviously his father must have objected to it. Maybe his father's no longer in the scene. We don't really know. But Paul decides to go ahead and have Timothy circumcised. And if you read commentaries on this, there are lots of people that make excuses and explain why this was important to Paul. My take on it is that Paul missed something here. And the reason I believe that is because if you look at Paul's life, you see that he, from the very beginning, is struggling with the change. He is really, really having a hard time with the transition that's happened in his life from the very beginning. In fact, the only way that God could kind of get it started was with that incredible encounter he had on the road to Damascus. And so once again, I think he is falling prey to this struggle of clinging to the past. And the reason I believe that is because he had just come from Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem Council itself said that the only thing that they had to worry about was meat offered to idols, and there was no mention anywhere of circumcision. And later, not very long after this, Paul preaches against circumcision. He said that it's foolish to be circumcised. It means absolutely nothing. So here we are in the situation, and I think that Paul has a lapse. And he's fearful of what the Jews might think. And sometimes when we cling to things from our past, not only does it distract us from what God wants to do in our thinking, but it also actually can have an ill effect on the people around us. I mean, this was obviously physically painful, and I'm sure must have raised some questions in Timothy's minds, like, really? Have to do this? And at Paul's insistence, he goes ahead. And so the important point here, I think, is to realize that our past thinking that we refuse to change is going to hinder us moving forward. And there are some things that we need to look at, we need to analyze, and we say, I've felt that way my whole life. Is that really something that is important? Is that really true? Am I clinging to ways of thinking that are holding me back? and not only holding me back, but are actually affecting other people as well. So then we come to this next episode, which is, I want to talk about the jailer and the situation in the jail. And Paul and Silas, are beaten without a trial. They're thrown into jail. There's an earthquake in the middle of the night. All these events are similar to what happened to Peter. And you remember what happened to Peter? He escaped in the middle of the night. And then, because he escaped, all the guards were executed. All the guards that were watching him were executed, and which was common Roman law. If you were a jailer and you were in charge of somebody and they escaped, you lost your life. You forfeited your life. And so I think that Paul, in that moment, thought about the story of Peter. He probably heard it, and undoubtedly heard it. He thought about the fact that those guards ended up losing their life over an act of God, and he determined that wasn't going to happen. So sometimes we make a choice in our life to care for people, to understand and to think and to listen to people and to imagine what they are feeling. Can't think of her name. What's the name of the book that you loaned me? Brene Brown talks about how important it is in these instances that rather than moving away from people that are different from us, we move close. And it's so easy for us to isolate ourselves from people that think different from us. And so here's Paul, and he's in this jail with Silas, and this guy that was involved with beating him is right outside the door. And literally, Paul has his life in his hands. And he's thinking of the pain maybe and the anguish and what that person put him through. And he has an opportunity to move away and say, yeah, you're gonna pay the price now. But instead, he moves closer. And he imagines perhaps what that person's perspective on life is. And that gives him the opportunity to not only see that other person's point of view, but to have an influence on him and to make a change in his life for the goodness of the gospel. So, in our journey to transform our minds, I so appreciate what Janelle said, because as we move closer to people, it helps us to love them and love them beyond the way that they think, which is different from us. And let me also just say that, we do establish borders in our life, and we don't need to let people close to us that are toxic or that are harmful, that are destroying our lives. But there are times when God puts people in our grove. We're in this grove, you're in a grove, and God will bring people into your grove that think radically different than you do. And the way that you need to respond to them isn't to pull back, but to pull closer. Isn't to move away from their thinking, isn't to look critically at their thinking, but to get closer to them and try to understand them and to try to see why is it that they're looking at life the way they are. Now jumping to the last person, which is the magistrate. Once again, I think Paul missed an opportunity here. So here's the story. So the next morning, they're having breakfast with the jailer. The magistrate sends information, just let these guys go, tell them to get out of town. Paul knows that the Roman law says that you cannot beat a Roman citizen without they first get a trial. You can beat them, but they have to have a trial. He didn't have a trial. And so what that magistrate did was life-threatening to himself. And so Paul's sitting there, and, you first read this and you think, yeah, stick it to the man, That's kind of our first reaction, isn't it? Yeah, Paul, way to go, Paul. But the truth is that when Paul chose to address that situation in that particular way, he immediately created a wall between himself and the magistrate. And the reason I think that this is a mistake here, because later Paul learns from this. And he has the same exact circumstance later on in his life that we'll come to, in which he turned the encounter rather from a confrontation into a meeting. And I think that Paul could have used different words and used different manner to bring this magistrate in such a way that he saw that Paul could have certainly done something harmful to him, but chose not to. Could have been loving and kind, and Paul didn't resist that, but took advantage of it. So there is a part of us that wants to justify our way of thinking. It thinks that justice is what's really important and that the right way of thinking is what's really important. And so we cling to ourselves, forgetting that what's more important than anything else is love. It isn't that justice is not important, but that love supersedes everything. And I think Paul missed an opportunity here. So as we continue through the book of Acts, I want you to notice Paul's progress, because I think it's really apparent. And we're still at the point where he hasn't written a single book. He hasn't written a single letter yet. So, but as we move through Paul's life, through the book of Acts, we are going to see a transition, a change in thinking, a way of looking at life that's changed more and more and more, that his mind is going to be transformed. And in fact, he will recognize that of himself, and he'll come to some places where he'll say, I used to think like a child. I used to think like a child, but God is transforming my mind. And in Romans, he says, the essence of spiritual growth is the transformation of my mind, and my mind is being transformed daily. And you're going to see that in Paul's life, and I hope in the future you will even see it in the different letters that he wrote. If you look at the chronology of his letters, you see a change in his thinking. And you will see things come out in there. That's amazing, because it is the process of God transforming Paul. And that's what he wants to do with us this year. He wants to transform our thinking so that we may be all that we possibly can. And we do that in community, and communion signifies that. So I want to just stop now and sing a hymn. If you take your hymnal and turn with me to 568.